In 2023, Marvel sold less than 4% of the graphic novels in North America. DC sold just 5%, and I'm cheating a bit because I'm not even including manga. If I did, DC and Marvel combined would have sold less than 5% of the graphic novels in North America.
Our Marvel sales are on an individual title basis are as low as they've ever been.
That's Brian Hibbs, who's been a comic retailer for 35 years. It was Hibbs' blog post which first brought these astonishing numbers to my attention. And while there's a lot of caveats around these numbers, which we'll get into, there's one undeniable conclusion. Over the past 15 years, there's been a dramatic shift in the graphic novel landscape, and yet it feels like almost no one is talking about it. Because here's the other thing with those numbers. While Marvel and DC struggled, one single publisher sold nearly 40% of non-manga graphic novels in the US. A publisher that didn't even exist 20 years ago. Who are they? How did this happen? Well, here's the most incredible thing that I found out while looking for that answer. Arguably, this entire video, the entire rewriting of the American comic book industry, comes down to just one man, Jeff Smith. How is that possible? How does one guy with a big dream and even bigger hair cause an entire industry to shift on its axis? Well, after months of trying, I was actually able to interview Jeff himself, so I hope you'll join me as we go back to the beginning of this epic journey. It's 1984, and 24-year-old Jeff Smith thinks his dreams are about to come true. He has spent his whole life wanting to be a newspaper cartoonist, and now he's sitting in an exclusive cartoonist club drinking Manhattans with Bill Yates, the head of King Features Syndicate and the most important man in newspaper comics, who oversees everything from Popeye to Prince Valiant.
This was a really big deal. I was really looking forward to this.
Jeff had spent the past 2 years pitching his own newspaper strip to King's middle managers, working his way up the corporate chain, and now here he was, hanging out with Bill Yates and getting a sneak peek at upcoming comic strips. It had been a long journey to this moment. It began when Jeff's father read him his first Peanuts comic at 5 years old. He immediately became obsessed with cartoons. He created his own character, Phone Bone, and would keep drawing and refining Bone and his cousins over the next decade. But then, at 17, Jeff made a trio of discoveries. A friend convinced him to read Lord of the Rings. Star Wars came out, and he found Heavy Metal magazine, where he was exposed to European fantasy cartoonists like Mobius and Enki Bilal. These new influences merged with his love of classic newspaper strips, and the purpose of his life came into focus. He would create a grand tale that put the cartoon characters from his childhood into an epic, heavy metal-inspired adventure. But that wasn't going to be easy. After high school, Jeff went to art school where he was in for a rude awakening.
The guy who ran that class was my favorite teacher at the Columbus College of Art and Design. Well, afterwards, I wanted to tell him how much I appreciated it, and I said how much I liked his life drawing. And he said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I want to draw comics. And the look on his face, his whole attitude changed, like, you need to just grow up. And I'm like, yeah. And he was like, listen, you need to just get serious about art, or you need to get out. And I said, okay, thank you. I turned around and I went over to the office and signed the papers to quit.
This is our first glimpse of the real Jeff Smith. Under his kindly Midwestern demeanor is an artist with such strong self-belief that he would rather drop out of college than compromise his artistic vision. He believed in the artistic and literary value of comics, even if no one else then did. Unwilling to compromise, he put his dreams aside and spent the next few years working menial jobs, mostly at his father's ice cream factory. But he couldn't run from cartooning. A few years later, he applied to college again, this time to Ohio State University, to both be closer to his girlfriend Vijaya and with a kind of devious plan. See, OSU had a popular college newspaper, so Smith signed up as a journalism major and then convinced the newspaper editors to publish his comic strip. This strip became his animating force at college. He was still working full-time and taking classes full-time, but every night from 9 p.m. until 2 a.m., while other kids partied, he drew his comic strip. And so, after graduation, he began pitching the strip to professional newspaper syndicates. It was a draining process. They'd want to see 2 full weeks of sample strips, and when they wanted changes, which they often did, he'd have to draw 2 more weeks of comics. What became clear is that they liked the humor, but not the fantasy. But Jeff gritted his teeth and complied. This was his dream, and he would do whatever it took. And so, after 2 years of back and forth and redrawing, of sanding away the personality from his strip, here he was, meeting with Bill Yates. Soon after those Manhattans, Smith was invited to Yates' office to show him the latest round of revisions, to have the conversation that would change his life. Yates looked over Jeff's latest work. I have a great idea, he said. Make all the characters talk in thought balloons. Why? Jeff asked, confused. Because Garfield talks in thought balloons. Jeff was devastated. He realized that even the guys at the very top of the newspaper cartoon business didn't want to take risks, didn't want his fantasy epic. They just wanted another knockoff of what was already working. But once again, Jeff would rather walk away than compromise on his vision. He knew he had an important story to tell, that cartoons could be art. As he left Yates' office, he accepted that his dream of an epic fantasy newspaper strip was never going to come true, and so he quit cartooning. He cut his hair, bought a suit, and started a company with a few friends to make animated commercials for local businesses. Like so many people, Jeff tucked his dream away in favor of a moderately fulfilling career that would pay the bills. Hey, at least he still got to draw, even if he only got to draw what his clients wanted. Okay, before we move on, there's something you need to know, and I hope it doesn't shock you, and please just keep in mind it's not me saying this. In the eyes of newspaper cartoonists and their fans, it was a much more serious art form than comic books. Newspaper cartoonists would both write and draw their strips. They created their own characters. They reached a huge audience of every age. Some even owned their own creations, like Jeff's hero Walt Kelly, who proudly put his copyright on every Pogo strip. By contrast, comic books were made on an assembly line by employees of big companies who wrote and drew other people's characters according to their demands, who reached only a niche audience of comic book diehards. These were commercial products without artistic merit. So imagine Jeff's surprise when, after having given up on cartooning, he saw a large newspaper article about the artistic merit of a new Batman comic. The comic was called The Dark Knight Returns, and its author, Frank Miller, was in this article talking about it like he's a real cartoonist, not some corporate hack. So Smith looks up a local comic shop and goes in and gets a copy of The Dark Knight Returns. It absolutely blows his mind. The way Frank Miller is manipulating time, manipulating space and composition, he's not only every bit as legitimate as a newspaper cartoonist, he's doing things with the comic page that would never be possible in a newspaper strip. So Smith goes back to the comic shop. If you've watched my ElfQuest video, you know that the mid-80s were a boom of specialty comic shops when new, small press and independent comics were appearing for the first time. Jeff discovers Love and Rockets, Lloyd Llewellyn, The Tick, Cerebus. He reads interviews in the Comics Journal with Linda Barry and Art Spiegelman. Comic books, he realizes, could be just as unique, exciting, and original as comic strips. He becomes obsessed. And so, by day, while he works at his animation company, an idea grows in the back of his mind. Could he bring back his newspaper strip as a comic book? Could he self-publish it and not have to deal with any bosses or executives?
So I thought this could work. This could work. And I figured it was my last shot at it.
He brings up the idea with his wife, Vijaya. Vijaya is supportive, but she has a suggestion. Write a business plan first. So Jeff heads to the library and learns everything he can about printing, self-publishing, distribution, and he puts together his plan.
Before he actually sold his piece of the animation company, I was like, I need a better paying job. So we moved from Columbus to Northern California. I think, would I give you 2 years?
1
year, I knew I could cover all of our expenses.
So that was basically it. I had 1 year. If after a year you don't have any reason to say this will go on or get better, we would have that talk, and I would have to go apply at Disney or something and get a job.
With the clock ticking, Jeff sells a stake in the animation company and begins to put together his comic. He spends the next few months not only writing and drawing his comic, but finding a printer, getting it into catalogs, shipping it to the distributor. And finally, at 31 years old, Jeff Smith publishes his first comic book. Bone is born. Bone hits comic shops in July of 1991, just as the extreme 90s are heating up. Barely anyone notices Bone, a tiny, cartoony, black and white comic. It sells about 1,500 copies, just enough to cover the printing cost. But soon after that, it looked like Jeff might be applying for that job at Disney. Sales for issue 2 dropped. Sales for issue 3 dropped even lower. By issue 4, he wasn't selling enough to cover the printing costs. But then something happened.
There was a guy in Ontario who did a comic book show, and he sent me some copies of videotapes of the show, and he says, watch this one to the very end. And the very last thing, he was interviewing Neil Gaiman, he was the guy in comics.
I love it when something comes completely out of left field and you've never heard of the guy who did it and you've never heard any of this stuff. I got handed 5 copies of Bone. Here, read this. And I got stuck in an airport somewhere and sat and read all 5 copies of Bone and laughed out loud a lot. Beautifully drawn, beautifully constructed, perfect pacing, and quite delightful.
I think I fainted. I don't remember. We just looked at each other and we went, okay, something's starting to happen here.
While sales might be struggling, people in the comic book community, people who knew how to spot quality, had recognized the appeal of Bone.
Neil Adams and Frank Miller and Joe Kubert, all these guys, I met them, and they didn't just say hi. They actually slapped me on the back and said, you're doing a good job, kid.
Jeff was encouraged to keep going despite the low sales, but he was running into another problem. Bone was getting labeled as a kid's book. But Jeff wasn't writing Bone for kids. He had made a conscious decision to write in the style of his hero Walt Kelly. No swearing, nothing extreme, but this was a serious work with serious themes. But getting labeled as a kid's book meant sales death.
There were very, 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 very few children coming in at that point. There was almost nothing being published for kids then. I mean, you got to remember that DC Comics at the time famously had their advertising slogan as DC Comics, they're not for kids anymore.
Jeff needed to do everything in his power to convince people that Bone was not a kid's book.
Bone is directed towards people my age who grew up watching Bugs Bunny, and they like good cartoons.
Eventually, Jeff settled on labeling Bone as an all-ages book. Not a term that he was particularly happy with, but at least one that wouldn't alienate the adult readers he depended on to buy the book. And then, just as Jeff was running out of time, something started to happen.
Like a lot of small press books, you tend to go light as a store. It was probably somewhere 5 to 8, somewhere in that range, where I started recognizing, hey, wait a minute, I'm buying a little bit more copies each month and they're selling out like that. There's something going on here. I need to pay closer attention.
Bone was catching on. From friend to friend, from eager retailers sharing it with their customers, Bone was starting to grow a lot.
I mean, the sales, you could just see it went from 2,000 or 3,000, quickly started jumping up to like 8, 40, 60,000.
Through the sheer quality of his work, through the commitment to his vision, Jeff was cutting through the noise of the 90s and finding a dedicated audience. But all this rapid growth was creating another problem.
I just couldn't keep up, and I was starting to spend all my time packing up boxes of 5 issues of number 1, 2 issues of number 7, and I was doing that all day, all week, and not working on my comics. And that's when we started talking about her coming and running the company.
There were things that I did on the side. I did the accounting, I kept the books. So I kind of was already doing it just after work, but it started to be too much for just a, side gig.
Despite still being on shaky financial ground, Vijaya believed in Jeff and quit her lucrative Silicon Valley job to run the business side of Bone full time.
Anytime we talk about Jeff, we always have to talk about Vijaya, because as a team, they were a team supreme. I think that if it had just been Jeff and there was no Vijaya, you would not know what Bone was today.
With Jeff freed up to focus on the creative side of Bone, things began to take off. Each month, sales grew and grew and grew until Bone was the best-selling independent comic on the stands. But before we get into all the craziness, we have to first ask why? Why Bone? Why did this book cut through hundreds of comics and find such a devoted fan base among readers, retailers, and so many comic professionals? Well, the easy answer is that it's a masterpiece, arguably the best American comic of the past 35 years. If that's all you need to know, good. Here's the link to go buy it. Enjoy. But if you're curious what makes it so wonderful, well, there's a lot we could talk about, but I'm going to try and keep this reasonably short and focus on one thing: time. You have to remember that Jeff was coming to Bone after years of animation, drawing minute changes in characters at 9 or 12 frames a second. This experience not only honed his draftsmanship, but gave me a unique appreciation for time. In animation, time is a constant, an immovable force that the artist works within. But in a comic, the cartoonist has to conjure up time onto the blank page, and arguably no cartoonist does that better than Jeff Smith.
When I'm writing a comic, I'm seeing it move like I'm watching television.
Every decision Jeff makes on a page of Bone is about manipulating your eye and brain to see what he is seeing, to feel what his characters are feeling. Because if you can feel it, you'll fall deeply inside the story and enter the world along with these characters. The first and most obvious way Jeff controls time is with layouts. Bone's pages might appear simple at first glance, 6 or 7 panels in fixed height rows, but look closer and you'll see that they're constantly shifting, establishing and breaking rhythms. A long panel here, 4 staccato panels there. In Jeff's hand, none of this is random. I mean, if you need proof that Jeff is a master, just look at how much storytelling happens on a page that basically only has a single drawing on it. He sets up a fixed-paced rhythm and then breaks it, and before he hits the punchline, he gives us a specific break in time to make it even funnier. But Jeff understands that layouts are only a fragment of how a cartoonist creates time.
It's controlling how quickly you get someone's eyes through the pen. That once you start inking, or even once you first tightening the pencils and the details are more specific, it slows down the speed. So if I'm inking it and I ink too much, then that stops. You have to look at what I just drew. I don't want you to look at what I drew, I want you to move on. So I will put that in shadow or simplify it. Same with the backgrounds. If you have too much backgrounds, that can mess you up unless you're supposed to look at the background.
Jeff makes this sound so obvious, but these are two incredibly insightful points. When you realize that every tree, every detail is in fact part of the way that Jeff is constructing your experience of time within this comic, I just want to grab it off the shelf and reread it again. There's examples of this everywhere, but let's just pick one. First, we can see how Jeff breaks away from his normal layout to emphasize the length of Phone Bone's fall. But observe the detail. It almost feels odd that the sky is just a blank white void, but that causes our eye to move quickly. But of course, when Phone Bone lands, he lands in a detailed horizontal landscape and kicks up a cloud of heavily rendered dust. That detail causes us to slow down, causes our eye to come to a stop just as the character does. Jeff accomplishes all of this without the use of speed lines, instead relying on composition and body language, which makes sense when you understand how he works.
I write my scripts with the words and the pictures all at the same time. So my scripts look like really fast scrawled comic books. Well, I take those and blow those up on a copier, and then I trace them onto the page. So I get the energy of that gesture drawing that I first did comes through.
Like a Disney artist, Jeff builds his stories up around gesture, the simple, energetic design of body language. He knows how to use gesture to create motion and emotion within a single panel, but then he combines these strong gestural images together to create well-timed action. But this attention to gesture isn't just for action scenes, it infuses every single page of Bone. Jeff borrows the classic animation technique of squash and stretch to allow his characters to become supernaturally expressive. Check out this simple exchange. Even without seeing the words, the body language tells us so much. Of course, this is where we remember that Jeff isn't just an artist, he's a writer of characters, of story, and of an epic. He's as inspired by Moby Dick as Uncle Scrooge. This is the great American novel written in images. This scope, on top of everything else, makes it so unique. While self-contained graphic novels existed, those comics didn't have the 1,300-page scope that Jeff envisioned, and most everything else on the shelves were designed to be endless, semi-episodic soap operas. As always, I'm not talking plot in detail because I don't want to spoil anything. I really want you to go read some comics, so I'll put that link up here one more time and down in the description. But this idea of having a clear beginning, middle, and end led Jeff and Vijaya to make a very daring, very controversial decision.
The real pushback was when we published the first 6 issues in a trade paperback.
Look, if you're living in a post-Bone world, you might not realize how radical the idea of collecting issues into a trade paperback was.
If there were 5,000 graphic novels in print, then I would be flabbergasted. It probably was under 2,000.
Why was this so controversial? Well, comic sales at this point in the 90s were largely driven by scarcity. This is in the midst of the boom of speculators entering the comic market, hoping to strike it rich by buying and selling valuable issues. But by collecting Bone, by making it available to anyone and everyone who wanted to read it, Jeff and Vijaya were offending those speculators. They immediately felt pushback from Wizard magazine, who importantly tracked or made up the value of the back issues of comics.
They knocked the price from $300 down to $150 of Bone #1. And I was pissed. I called them up and said, what is that? They said, look, you just made it available for $10. Well, I said, so what? This is catch up, man. This is the way we're going from now on.
Jeff and Vijaya wanted Bone to be enjoyed by readers, and it turns out they were ahead of their time. For a variety of reasons, many of them tied to this rampant speculation, the comic market completely collapsed in the mid-90s. This was frustrating for Jeff and Vijaya, because even though they had refused to participate in the speculation madness, they still had to pay the price as stores, distributors, and publishers closed all around them. While so many indie comics died off during the crash, Jeff and Vijaya's commitment to readers kept them afloat. They emerged on the other side with lower sales, but still on the journey, still on track to complete Jeff's epic vision. But their biggest challenges were still ahead of them. But while Jeff and Vijaya work to rebuild their business, we need to leave them for a moment and head 500 miles east to New York City and to a surprising place. The office of children's publisher Scholastic Books. To say that Scholastic was riding high at this point is kind of an understatement. In 1998, they began publishing a little series in the US called Harry Potter. The creative director at Scholastic, who had designed the look of Harry Potter and oversaw the creative direction of the rest of their line, was David Saylor. Like Jeff Smith, Saylor had fallen in love with comics at a young age when he had inadvertently stumbled across one of the geniuses of the medium. But Saylor had tucked that love of comics away as he went to work on picture books and kids' novels. But in the early 2000s, Saylor had an idea, one that sounds so obvious in retrospect, but was actually pretty novel at the time.
I just thought, well, why aren't we doing comics for kids? Like we should be, we could be.
Saylor at first began exploring this idea casually. He hired an assistant who also loved comics, and together they began exploring this world, connecting with agents and artists and visiting Comic-Con in 2003.
It blew my mind, like how how much talent there was out there, how much artistic talent that was working in comics, but they weren't doing kids' comics, really.
See, the effect of the comic industry's determination to grow up in the 80s and 90s had lasted. And still, pretty much no one was making comics for kids, and no kids were reading comics. But as Saylor began pushing his idea of Scholastic publishing comics forward, he ran into resistance.
I had sort of thought, oh, people don't have any prejudices about comics anymore, right? But it was very much the case that there was still a lot of prejudice about comics, certainly among educators.
But Saylor persisted and soon convinced his boss, Gene Feiwel, that Scholastic publishing comics could be a big idea. And unlike so many big company executives, Feiwel was famous for being a risk taker and got on board with the idea. And so, with her approval, Scholastic's Comic Imprint Graphics was born. But now they needed to find a comic that would be the centerpiece of this new line. And while they do that, we're going to take a trip back to Ohio. As they worked to rebuild their business after the crash, Jeff and Vijaya decided it was time to expand. Their first venture was to create toys based on bone, but they were in for a rude awakening.
Toys, I mean, they'll cut you. I'm like, oh wow, I didn't know. I'm not really competing with you, but you wanna take me down. So that was kind of an eye opener.
And while that investment in toys was creating a lot of financial pressure, they had also tried expanding into publishing comics by other creators, which ended poorly too. Finally, Jeff had put the comic on hiatus because he was working to develop Bone as an animated movie with Nickelodeon. But after 2 years of development, he realized once again that the executives in suits were not going to honor his vision, and he walked away. It was one defeat after another. By 2001, Jeff and Vijaya were forced to lay off all of their staff besides one person.
There was a point where we had to move out of our office and we were operating out of Jeff's studio.
Jeff had only a few issues of Bone left to finish his story, but with how bad everything was going, he was worried he wouldn't make it. But around this time, there was another force, an unsung force in our society that was about to change the course for both Bone and Scholastic. Librarians. In 2002, Jeff, along with other top comic creators Art Spiegelman, Neil Gaiman, and Colleen Doran, were invited to speak at the annual Librarian Conference. They knew that librarians had a massive ability to not only purchase books, but also to make them popular.
Okay, this is our big chance. We're going to convince the librarians these are real books, because that's what we've been hearing from the outside world, you know. Comics aren't real books. That's not reading. Kids can't read that.
But there was something Jeff and Vijaya didn't know. Savvy retailers around the country had been buying Bone from them and reselling it to libraries.
We went into that library conference, and they didn't want to know what we thought the worth of comics were. They just wanted to know when we were going to make more of them, because they knew the kids were reading them. And adults.
While circulation was going down among libraries, graphic novels were going up, and one of the biggest hits in the library system was Bone. And so, with the support of librarians buying their trade paperbacks, Jeff was back on track to finish the final issues of Bone.
There was a moment there that I wondered if we were going to make it. I remember having some bad nights, but we made it.
Bone had become the comic self-publishing success story. While not at the levels of Marvel or DC, they had been able to weather the storms and keep going for over a decade and had built up a large, devoted reader base. But Jeff and Vijaya, never ones to be satisfied, still thought Bone could be bigger.
For me as a publisher with limited marketing funds, limited resources, I'm like, this is as good as I can do. This is as far as I can take this title. So the next step is, let's see if we can get a real publisher to pick it up.
They had already gone to New York to meet the big publishers, but none of them seemed to know what to do with Bone. They wanted to turn it into a picture book or novelize it. None of them could say where in the bookstore it would even be shelved. Just like at King Features, just like at Nickelodeon, the suits once again could not grasp Jeff's vision. But there was someone who they hadn't met yet, someone who's about to make a startling discovery.
We were definitely talking with librarians and asking them, well, are your kids reading comics? What comics are they reading? What are the books that are being checked out? Bone kept rising to the surface of things that librarians were talking about. It was something that most people hadn't even heard of.
So Saylor's assistant runs out and grabs all of the available Bone books from the bookstore, and they both tear through it. This was it. This was the book that could be at the center of Scholastic's new line. They just would have to convince Jeff and Vijaya of that. And Saylor knew that wasn't going to be easy.
There was a lot of bad feeling because a lot of artists had been abused by indie comics publishers, and even the big, the top two had been quite abusive in terms of what they gave, the contracts they gave to artists.
They would also have to convince Jeff that this book, that he'd so staunchly marketed towards adults, was now going to be marketed as a kid's book. But little did Saylor know that Jeff and Vijaya had made that discovery all on their own.
I mean, people would start coming back because we would put out a new book every year and debut it in the San Diego Comic-Con. About 4 years in, they started coming in with dates, and their girlfriends were reading the book. Well, about 5 years after that, they started bringing in their kids.
Secretly, without any marketing, Bone had organically found an entirely new audience of kids. And then the phone rang.
I remember Kathleen, who was working with us, she says, "Hey, as president of Scholastic's on the line for you, Vijay. She wants to talk to you." Vijay goes in her office, but the three of us are all outside the door like the Marx Brothers.
But Jeff and Vijay were skeptical. After their last go-around with the publishers, they didn't want a company who's just going to try and change Jeff's vision for the comic. But David and the team flew out to Ohio to convince Jeff and Vijaya that they loved comics, that they didn't want to change Bone, but they just wanted to use their marketing and distribution muscle to bring it to a whole new audience.
My only hesitation and question to Scholastic was, where are you going to put it? Because if you're going to put it with Dungeons and Dragons books, or or some kind of coloring book or pop-up section, which is what we've been hearing, and they went, no. We're going to put it next to the Harry Potter books. Where do I sign?
But maybe it was all too good to be true, because just as Jeff and Vijay arrived in New York to sign the contract, they ran into another problem.
So we went out, we flew out there. We were very excited. And then that morning, we got a call from Jean's Firewall secretary. Jean was wondering if you'd come in 15 minutes early just to have a little talk with her. We're like, oh, okay. We hung up the phone and we went, uh-oh. Went into Jean's office and she pulls the stack of the 9 Bone books that we'd published and puts them on the table. In the stack are it seems like hundreds of
little post-it
notes with words like dang or drinking. She was like, "Can't we just want to change these to different words like they do in Harry Potter?" We said, it's too late. Very sorry, but we can't make this last minute change. And if you don't want to go forward, we'll just leave. She looked at us for a second. Then she picked up the pile of books, put them down on the ground and said, "All right, let's go sign the papers."
I didn't get to talk to Jean for this video, but she sounds like a badass. Because besides adding color, Scholastic agreed to not change anything about Bone. The first Scholastic edition of Bone, in color and in a smaller trim size so it could be filed next to Harry Potter, hit bookstores in February of 2005. Its success wasn't immediately apparent. Scholastic still had to contend with prejudices against comic books that Americans held.
Are you dumbing down things for the culture by making comics for kids and prose is better than comic? I mean, there was this whole discussion about whether prose books were better for you than comics.
They put out a pamphlet for teachers and parents explaining what graphic novels were, made an effort to fight those prejudices. And don't underestimate the power Scholastic had with their book fairs, piping fresh, hot books directly into the hallways of schools around the country. We don't know how many copies of Bone sold in schools and libraries, but we do know how it sold in stores. In 2006, its first full year in print, Bone sold 100,000 copies. Pretty good for a comic that once struggled to sell 1,000 copies. But then in 2007, it sold 166,000, 266,000 in 2008, and in 2009, the year Scholastic printed the final book in color, they sold 356,000 copies.
We were reprinting like the 3rd or 4th book when they started putting over 1 million copies sold on the cover. Blew our little minds.
Since 2005, Scholastic has sold nearly 10 million copies of Bone, making it one of the best-selling American comics of all time. But Sailor and Scholastic still had to prove that they could do more than just reprint a book that was already a hit.
Bone became sort of that guidepost for me of what graphics could be.
Their next big hit was Amulet, another fantasy epic with cutesy characters made by devoted Jeff Smith fan Kazu Kibuishi. But it was another Jeff Smith fan, Raina Telgemeier, who, with her graphic memoir Smile, brought Scholastic up to the #2 sales position, just behind DC. Then they recruited Dave Pilkey, creator of Captain Underpants, who took their sales into the stratosphere. By 2015, Scholastic was the #1 American publisher of graphic novels, and they have been ever since. So no, the comic industry isn't dying, don't listen to anybody who says that. It's quite the opposite, actually, unless you choose to only look at comics being published by Marvel and DC. So what is going on with Marvel and DC?
It is literally insane to me that neither Marvel nor DC appear to be able to sell their collected editions to the general public anymore. Whereas Scholastic has no problem selling their stuff to the general public. Viz has no problem selling manga to the general public. You know, I have to think that that's the fault of somebody at Marvel and DC. And not the fault of the market, because it's not that the market doesn't want comics. The market clearly wants comics, but they don't want what Marvel and DC are putting up on offer. in the fashion that they're putting it up on offer.
If you want to argue in their favor, you could point out that the numbers we have don't account for single issue sales, which stopped being reported in 2019. So maybe that growth has offset their failing in the graphic novel business. I put that exact question to Brian.
Anecdotally, this is not what I'm hearing from my fellow retailers. My fellow retailers are saying similar things that I'm saying, maybe not as stridently as I do.
So why can't Marvel and DC sell graphic novels? There's a lot of reasons, and I want to hear your thoughts as well, so please comment down below and subscribe for when I do a follow-up video. But there's one undeniable fact. Because of Scholastic, for the past 20 years, kids have had easier access to great cartooning than any time in history since Crazy Cat was in the Sunday paper. I mean, they have Bone in the hallways of their schools. And yes, in a way, that hurts Marvel and DC. Because this audience has high standards. They're used to works by solo cartoonists that are self-contained or have big, clear numbers on the side. That's why so many of them graduate from Scholastic directly into manga and never even bother to go on Reddit to find a Secret Wars reading order guide. The new reality is that kids are reading graphic novels at an unprecedented rate, and Marvel or DC or any publisher or cartoonist is only one great comic away from finding them. And why is this the world we live in? Because since the 1980s, Jeff Smith has fought. From the time he was 18 years old, people had been telling him that his vision, that the entire medium he loved, did not have value. But he was so determined to tell his story without compromise that instead of letting the realities of the industry warp his dream warped the reality of the industry around itself. That is the power of great art. That is the power of an artist who believes in himself. And, perhaps most importantly, that is the power of a couple that supports each other. Thank you guys so much for watching. Of course, huge thanks to Jeff, Vijaya, Brian, and David for taking the time to speak with me. Jeff and Vijaya are doing a Kickstarter right now for a new oversized hardcover edition of Bone that looks absolutely beautiful, so I'll put a link to that down below. Brian runs Comix Experience in San Francisco, so if you're in the area, you should definitely check it out. It's a great store, and even if you're not, you can join their book club where they send you a hand-picked standalone graphic novel each month and hold online discussions and author interviews. Finally, my huge thanks go out to Stephen McCraney, who's been instrumental in helping me navigate and understand the world of middle grade comics, and without whom this video would not be possible. I'll put links down below so you can check out his awesome series Spaceboy. And the bonus fact for those of you that stuck around, the Columbus College of Art and Design that once drove Jeff out now not only offers a degree in making comics, but they invite Jeff back as a speaker.
I could really get into more of this TV stuff, though. See you next time on the Anti-Gravity Room.